All right, what we're looking at today is Abraham Lincoln. Um, Abraham Lincoln is widely considered the best president in American history. Almost any list that you're gonna find is gonna have him at least in the top three, and consensus overall, he's gonna be number one. And as I said in the last lecture, he was president pretty much for the entirety of his presidency was the Civil War. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at four Lincoln speeches. And the purpose of this is to not do like hero worship. Lincoln was a flawed individual, and has several things in his biography that we could criticize or that we could look down on negatively. But as our greatest president, we're going to try to see, what he did throughout the war. And I think what in going over this, you'll get a better grasp of him, and you'll also get a better grasp of the Civil War in general. Um, so where we're going to look, we're going to go on the unit page, and I put a new link that says notes on Lincoln's famous speeches. So these notes that I'm using for the lecture, you'll have them. And we're going to look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and then Lincoln's second inaugural. And all four of those are linked on this document too. But this is where they're at. And these are in chronological order. So we're going to kind of look at how Lincoln grows and evolves throughout the Civil War. So I'm going to click here. And we're going to start with Lincoln's first inaugural address. The note that I put here is I really feel like Lincoln's first inaugural address is Lincoln at his boldest. In classes in the past, I've kind of said this is his Samuel L. Jackson moment where he just kind of stares down his opponent and kind of lays out some terms and some ultimatums that are pretty powerful. The key points of the first inaugural is he does state the purpose of the war, and he's very, very clear that his purpose in the Civil War is not to abolish slavery, but instead to preserve the Union. And we have to understand that he's kind of setting the terms of the war and saying that this is not about abolishing slavery. Now, that's going to be interesting, as we go through some of these other documents. He more or less dares the South to start the war. So let's just look at a few things in the speech. And these are just excerpts. So it's not the whole speech. We got a little bit from the beginning, a little bit from the middle, and a little bit from the end. But in this opening part of the inaugural, he says this: as president, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Okay, nothing new there. He's essentially stating the policy of the Republican Party. Let slavery exist where it was. Just don't let it expand. He says, I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. So he says, legally, as president, he is not lawfully allowed to abolish slavery. And personally, as far as his desires, he has no inclination to do so. I always ask my students, what's going on here? Is he lying? He's honest Abe. We know that eventually he is going to be the great emancipator, that he is going to abolish slavery and kind of finish the war to free the slaves. So what's he doing here? Well, he's not lying. At the beginning of the war in March of 1861, Lincoln truly believes that he does not have the lawful right to end slavery. And in terms of inclination, if you look back in Lincoln's past, he's got lots of racist statements and quotes, and he is not necessarily the most progressive person on African American rights in 1861. That is something that will change, and we'll get more to that towards the end of the next speech. I'm not going to say too much on this middle paragraph. This is where Lincoln refers back to Andrew Jackson and the idea of the Union being perpetual, that secession is not allowed, and the Union is impossible to destroy. He will fight this war to preserve the Union. That's what he's saying here. And then finally, in closing, he says, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen. He's speaking to the 7 states that are in rebellion. In your hands and not in mine is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. In other words, he's saying to the South, the blood will be on your hands. When this war is fought, and over 600,000 Americans die. That's on his watch as president, but he's putting the onus, so to speak, on the South. And in fact, what's essentially going to start the war at Fort Sumter is the South has surrounded this northern Army fort. Fort Sumter is in South Carolina, but it's a Union fort. And when Lincoln sends in a resupply ship, not an attack ship, he sends in a resupply ship, the South will fire shots at Fort Sumter, and that's how the war will begin. So Lincoln was essentially baiting or calling the South to be the aggressors in the war. He did not want to be the aggressor, and he will achieve that at Fort Sumter. Okay, so this is Lincoln. That's his first inaugural. And that was March of 1861. Fast forward to September of 1862, and we're going to look at maybe the most famous Lincoln night. Now, this technically isn't a speech. This was a written document, a proclamation, but this is Lincoln, what I would say, at his most strategic. The Emancipation Proclamation, a proclamation of freedom. I said 4 big things to know about the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it didn't free any slaves. This is important. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free any slaves. It's a statement of intent, of rule. It's technically an executive order, but it only has effect if the people that it's speaking to listen. And Confederates were not going to listen. This is why you're going to have to fight the rest of the war to actually liberate the slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation isn't actually going to free any slaves, but it's still strategic and it's still super important. So let's see what's going on. 4 things that I'm going to want you to know. I'm going to talk about all of these. It gave a moral purpose to the war. It was strategically smart with the border states. It was diplomatically powerful by sending a message to Great Britain and France, and it shows Lincoln's personal growth and adaptability. All right, so let's go look at this. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on September 22nd in September. Now, if you look up here, the date says January 1st. It's going to be issued on the 22nd of September, but go into effect at the 1st of the next year. That is 100 days. From September 22nd to January 1st is 100 day. And the Emancipation Proclamation is essentially a statement to the South that says, in 100 days, we're going to emancipate slaves. That on the 1st day of January in the year of our Lord, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. Persons held as slaves in states of rebellion from then forward will be forever free. Here's what the Emancipation Proclamation is saying. If you are a slave in a state of rebellion, you are going to be declared free on January 1st. This changes what the war essentially was about. It changes it from a political cause, the preservation of the Union, to a moral cause, personal freedom, self-determination. Up to this point, the Civil War is a political war about secession, states' rights, preserving the Union. This says, no, it is going to be about slavery and the end of it. This is about freedom. So the Emancipation Proclamation changes, in essence, the purpose of the war. It gives it a moral purpose. The other thing I said is that it's strategically smart with the border states. This only applies to states or designated parts of states where the people are in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation was not a statement to Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, or Delaware. Lincoln was still being very strategic with those important border regions, saying, hey, if you have slaves there, you can keep the slaves. This is not about ending slavery in those states. This is about ending slavery in the states that are in rebellion. And you say, well, why is that distinction important? Well, it goes back to Lincoln's first inaugural, and where he said he had no lawful right or no inclination to abolish slavery. He's still not there with the border states, and he doesn't want to be there because he wants to keep them loyal to the Union. He can't lose them. But in terms of his legal rights and his inclination, what Lincoln goes on to say is we are now at war. At his inauguration, we were not at war. And as commander in chief, if this is a war measure, he now has the legal right and personally the desire to end slavery in those states of rebellion. At its core, the Emancipation Proclamation is a military strategy document. Lincoln is saying the best way for the North to win the war is to liberate slaves in the states in rebellion. This is strategically very, very clever with the border states. If Lincoln had just said, hey, we're outright going to abolish all slavery, he probably would have had uprisings, riots, and rebellion in the border states, and that could have changed the course of the war. So he says it this way to just say, look, this is a military measure. This is a tactic to win the war. At the same time, it is still giving a moral purpose to the war, and that's where the diplomatically powerful comes in. Look who signs off on this. At the end of the proclamation, it says, by the President Abraham Lincoln and William H. Seward, Secretary of State. What the heck is that about? Why is the Secretary of State, who is dealing with foreign affairs, why is he being consulted and signing off on this? Because deep down, this is an international message to the world. For all of the foreign observers of our war that may think, hey, it is just a political struggle about secession and states' rights, Lincoln is saying no, and Seward, his Secretary of State, is saying this is about the moral issue of slavery. And it's essentially telling Great Britain and France, don't get involved. If Great Britain or France would recognize and aid the Confederacy, there's a very good chance the Confederacy would win the war. And in fact, the Confederacy felt that was their best hope. You remember during the American Revolution, who comes to our aid and recognizes our independence? France. And they formed a treaty of alliance, and then they're right there by our side when we defeated the British at Yorktown. In the same sense, the Confederates were counting on Great Britain or France to recognize and join them in their fight for secession. And this proclamation essentially says to Great Britain and France, keep out. If you join in and recognize you are now on the immoral side of history, you are going to fight in favor of slavery. And Great Britain and France won't do that. Several students asked what their prerogative was. They essentially stayed out of the war, and they refused to recognize or come to the aid of the Confederacy. The last thing about this is I just think it's worth highlighting that Lincoln has grown. He went from a position of the war is not about slavery. He had no legal or personal interest in abolishing it, to now he is saying that. Lincoln will continue to grow. And I think this is one of the reasons that people love Lincoln, is by the time of his death, Lincoln has become an emancipator, an abolitionist. And in fact, he's in favor of African Americans having the full rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. In 1861, Lincoln probably wasn't there. But this document is showing that as a leader, he's willing to change, grow in a positive direction. All right. The next speech, the Gettysburg Address. This will fast forward to November of 1863. And I said this is Lincoln at his most inspirational. What's he doing at the Gettysburg Address? He's commemorating Gettysburg Cemetery. You remember the Battle of Gettysburg was in July. of 1863, so many soldiers died on that battlefield, they couldn't move them. They just essentially turned the battlefield into a graveyard. And in November, Lincoln comes back as they're going to commemorate that as a national cemetery. Lincoln was not the keynote speaker. Famously, he wrote the Gettysburg Address in just a few minutes on the train ride to the ceremony. It's one of his shortest speeches, and you'll see it in its entirety here in a second. It recalls back to our foundations, to the Declaration of Independence, and he talks about rebirth. What's interesting, if you look at the Gettysburg Address, is he's no longer talking about preserving an old union, but living up to the ideals of what our new, new nation were meant to be. Um, um, so let's look at this. This is Gettysburg Address. This is the whole thing. November 19th, 1863. It's just those three little paragraphs. It starts with the famous 7 years ago. A score is 20, so 4 is 87 years ago. 87 years ago, and he's going back to the Declaration of Independence. It's important that when Lincoln says, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation," that he's going back to the Declaration of Independence. This idea that all men were created equal. He's not going back to the Constitution, with the 3/5 compromise and the fugitive slave clause and all of that stuff. He's going back to what we were meant to be, an ideal that we had not yet lived up to. He says that essentially we're engaged in a great civil war to see if a nation based on that principle can endure. This was a war about preserving a nation, but it's also about a war that's creating something new. He says, all the people that died at this war, he says, let's not let them die in vain. We highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. What he's saying here is we were created on the principle of all men or all mankind, all persons being created equal, and we have not lived up to that. But this civil war can be a rebirth. It can be a rebirth of that principle. And he says that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. And again, as I said, this is Lincoln at his most inspiring. And I think it's interesting. He wrote this quickly on the way there. He was not the keynote speaker, but he says in here, where is it at? The world will little know nor long remember what we say here. He says nobody's going to remember this little speech I'm giving, but in fact, it is probably one of his most powerful. And it redefines the war again and says it's not about preserving an old union, but creating or having a rebirth of freedom, and that our government will try to live up to the ideals that it was meant to live up to. Okay. Finally, and I know this is long, and I might give you guys 2 days to watch this lecture because it is so long. Lincoln's second inaugural. I said this is Lincoln at his most gracious. This is after his reelection, and the war is about to be over. Unfortunately, so is Lincoln's life. This is not his last words, but in some senses, it's kind of his last message before his assassination. He does a few things in this inaugural address is very short. He says slavery was indeed the cause of the Civil War. He says he's not sure what God's purpose was, but it is now our job to forgive and heal. So let's look at this. Again, this is the whole speech, not just excerpts. So that's the whole thing, about 4 paragraphs there. It says he says, when we were here 4 years ago, we were all anxiously awaiting civil war. We all dreaded it. We all sought to avert it. but he says it was going to happen. It was almost inevitable. He then goes on to talk about slaves, and um, he says we all knew that this was, in some sense, the cause of the war. Um, um, all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. And it's interesting, now that the war is over, he can say that boldly. He wouldn't have necessarily said that at his first inaugural, but now as the war is about to be over, he can say that. Again, he talks about God. The Almighty has his own purposes. He doesn't know what it is, but when he gets to the end, he says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wound, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This is Lincoln at his most gracious, forgiving and seeking healing. If Lincoln had lived, it is interesting to think, what would Reconstruction, what would civil rights, what would freedom for former slaves look like with this type of leadership? Lincoln, and you can know this, his position towards Reconstruction was leniency. It was forgiveness, healing, and grace. When Lincoln is assassinated and new leadership comes to take on the task of Reconstruction, that's where we're going to run into some debates and some very difficult parts of our history. All right. This was a long lecture. I may split it into two. I may put it up there and just say, watch it at your own pace. But I think these are four important Lincoln documents, four speeches that show his importance. It shows the trajectory of the Civil War and how our nation was changing and being changed through this bloody affair. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great weekend.